So you finished your quilt, and now it's time to put on the binding. Well, we're going to do a binding, a traditional one, and we're going to do a scalloped one. We're going to use the Baby Lock Presto too to see how our machine can help us. And I'm Kathy. This is Sewing Tech Talk. So we have a giveaway for today's video. We have this great pack of thread. Every time you like, share, or comment, you're entered for a chance to win a pack of thread. So like, share, or comment. Every time you do, you could be the winner. So now when you're doing the binding on a quilt, there's lots of choices that you have. We're just going to cover a few of them today. I have a handout that takes you through the process. We're going to be talking about a double fold binding, a single fold binding. I'm going to be going from the front to the back, from the back to the front, and we're going to be doing a scallop. So there's a lot to cover. So let's talk about, first of all, preparing the quilt. Now this is a quilt I've finished, and I'm going to put just a basic binding on here. I'm going to use the double fold binding, and what that means is the binding has been a strip of fabric folded right sides, wrong sides together, and then the folded edge comes around either to the front or the back. It's a pretty standard binding. The way I'm going to do it on this quilt is I am going to do it so that I'm going to sew it down by machine. And I wanted to show you that because it's a pretty fast binding. It's a great choice. Say you're going to give a quilt to a child, something you want a really sturdy binding on there because you know they're going to be messing with that binding. So what we have to do is we have to prepare the quilt and get it ready to sew the binding on. So what you have to do is you need to look at the edges of the quilt. Obviously that's where the binding is going to go. And I like to make my edges of my corners of my quilt square. If I want them square, then that's what I want, is I want them square. So I use instead of a long ruler, I use a larger square because that gives me a longer edge on either side, and I can kind of see what's going on when I'm making it square. Now, there's a couple kinds of quilts. There's the kind of quilt that you're done with it, or you're over it and you just want it really quickly finished. So there's that kind of a quicker binding. There's also a binding that you want to take extra time. Maybe you've been working on a quilt for about 5 years and it just has to be perfect. So one way to do it, if you just want this bad boy done, is you can bring up your square and you can mark around the edge, or you can just go ahead, take your rotary cutter and your ruler, and you can just cut it off square. But sometimes when you quilt a quilt may shrink up. Sometimes when you heavily quilt it, it shrinks up and you get something wavy on the edge. That has to be taken care of, because if you don't, your binding's not going to work out very well. So what you can do if that's happened to you is I go ahead and I kind of lay out my quilt, I moisten it, and I'm kind of flattening it just to make sure I'm taking care of those wrinkles on the edge. So you could use water. I like to use Best Press 2 because that adds a little bit of body into my fabric. And sometimes you can use either Best Press 2 has a little bit more body, Best Press just some. You can use water if you want to. And I also use a steam iron sometimes to get everything nice and square. So if you need to do that, now's a good time to do that. Now, for this quilt, I'm going to go from the back to the front. In other words, I'm going to sew the binding onto the back and I'm going to bring it around to the front. Why do I do that? Well, if you've ever tried to do a binding sometimes, when you sew it to the front, bring it around to the back, and you're going to sew it with the machine, sometimes it's really hard because you can't see it to hit that little lip on the bottom. I find that sometimes almost impossible to do. So what I do is I make my binding strip just a little bit wider and I bring it to the front. I go ahead and sew it along that front edge. Well, you'll see when we get to the machine. But for me, that means that I'm going to catch that edge. It's going to work really, really well. It's going to be a machine sewn down binding, and I don't have to stress about what's on the back. Of course, my Baby Lock Presto is going to help me quite a bit on that as well. So what I'm going to do on this quilt is I'm going to cut around the edges. I'm going to square those up, and I'm going to take it to the machine. We're going to sew the binding on the back and bring it around to the front. Now in your handout, I also have a couple of little charts that tell you approximately how much yardage you're going to need to get to cut different kind of binding strips. This is like that double fold binding, like I said. I cut my strips about 2.5 inches. So I cut them 2.5 inches, and I'm going to end up with a 1/4 inch binding. Now, how does that work with a 2.5 inch strip? Well, I fold the binding wrong sides together, and I kind of mimicked my seam here. This is a 1/4 inch seam. And then this is going to fold up over, that's the folded edge of the binding. Well, what happens is when you fold it up and over, it takes up more room because the quilt is thick. It's the turn of the cloth. So instead of this being 1/4 inch and this being 1/4 inch like you think they would be, what happens is your quilt has thickness, kind of like this ruler has a thickness. So when you turn around this outside edge of the quilt, it's going to take up a little bit of room. So I like to use a 2.5 inch strip when I'm doing this type of technique. Now, when I'm doing a single fold binding, that's what I'm going to use to do that scalloped edge. It's just a single strip of cloth. And I cut mine about 1 1/4 inches. That gives me enough room to have the 1/4 inch seam on the front. And when I turn it around to the back, I'm going to hand sew this one down. And that gives me plenty of room in the middle to cover that edge of that quilt. So, one last thing before we run over to the machine. When we join our binding strips, what we're going to do, and I thought you might like to see this laid out flat before we get to the machine and sew it down. I like to sew my binding strips with a diagonal seam. That means I'm going to take any of the strips that I'm going to join, and instead of sewing them end to end, what I do is I lay them kind of in an X. And I'm going to sew from the one side to the other. See how that's an indent there and an indent there? When I sew it along there, what happens is when I open this seam out, that takes that seam, the bulk of the seam, and it spreads it along the binding. And it's not one big lump right in the middle. So that's kind of what I do. The last little thing before we go to the machine is we have to talk briefly about the grain of the fabric. What's the grain of the fabric? Well, here's a piece of fabric, and this edge right here is the selvage edge. That's the edge that's along the side when the fabric's folded on the bolt. So that has the least stretch possible. That's the side that is going to kind of give you very, very strong edge. But side to side, from selvage to selvage, that has a little bit of stretch. Quite honestly, that's kind of what I use for my traditional binding. So I'm just cutting strips along there, along that crosswise grain. The last grain is something that's called bias, and I'm sure you've heard of bias before. That's when we cut diagonally across the fabric, and that gives you the absolute most stretch. That's the kind of binding strip we're going to use for our scalloped edges. Don't necessarily have to have that for the regular quilt. You could. In your handout, I tell you how to cut it, how to sew it together, and the amount of yardage you usually need for a usual quilt. So it's a pretty handy handout for this one. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut the edge of my quilt. I'm going to use my ruler, get my corners pretty square. Then we're going to head on over to the machine and we're going to sew our binding strips together. I've sewn some of them together already, and we're going to sew it on with the Presto. And then real quickly after that, we're going to head over to the scallop binding because I know you want to know about that. So I'm going to trim up my quilt and then I'll meet you over at the Baby Lock Presto 2 because she's really going to help us put this binding on. So I've sewn around most of the quilt because it takes a while to sew around a quilt. So I've done that. Let me show you how we join those binding pieces diagonally, and then we're going to do a corner on this quilt, and then we're going to join the two end pieces with my personal technique to get it nice and flat with a diagonal seam. So let's watch. So here we go. I'm just going to sew along from, you put the binding pieces like in an X, and you sew from the side to the side. Now, you're not going to want to sew this way. If you do sew that way accidentally, you'll know it because when you open it out, it's not going to look like you want it to look. So we're going to sew from one side to the other, bring it along there, and here we go. If you're not confident, go ahead and draw that diagonal line on there. going to use the scissors on the Presto. Now, what happens when I do that is I'll take off my clips. I'm going to trim this seam, of course, but when I open it out, it's going to be a nice diagonal seam. And after I trim this, I open both of those, the sides of the seam, so I open the seam up flat. So that's how I did my binding to join it in a diagonal seam. Now, let's sew onto the quilt. Now, the one thing that's great about this Baby Lock Presto is it is an electronic machine. And what does that mean? That means that when you set up the machine, you have lots of choices. And when you pull up a stitch, it's going to automatically go to that stitch and set it up. Now, you can modify that stitch. Now, the one thing about modifying the stitch on an electronic machine is you're not using a dial and guessing. So every time you want to come back and duplicate that stitch, you're literally going exactly where you want it to be. Now on the Presto, I do have a 1/4 inch seam, and I am using the Baby Lock 1/4 inch foot without guide. I can use my regular standard presser foot because there's a 1/4 inch seam built, a stitch that's built into the Presto where I use the side of that foot. But I like using the 1/4 inch foot because it's a little bit of a broader profile along the bottom of it. And I have this edge right here that's a great guide for me to see where I'm stitching. Also, the hole in the middle is small, which is what you want on a 1/4 inch foot, but it's wide enough so that I can move that needle just a hair to the left or the right. Now, some of you may sew with and naturally do a seam that's a little bit fatter or a little bit skinnier. The foot can really help you. So I like to come to the regular standard center stitch, which has a needle position of 3.5. But I have a tendency to ride a little bit more here, so I move the needle over to the right just a 1/2 millimeter. All I have to do is punch that plus button and it moves that needle precisely over a 1/2 millimeter, and every time I come back to sew a binding, I can re-achieve that same thing. So let's sew this rest of this binding. Let me line it up, and we're going to come to the corner because the corner is where we can do the magic. So here we go. Now, if you're not confident with sewing your seam, take your time when you're sewing a binding on a quilt, because if you wobble just a little bit, it's not going to show too much, but you don't want to get super fat or super skinny on your seam. You want to have it pretty consistent going all the way around. See how I'm using this inside edge? It's a good visual guide for me. Now, we are coming to the corner, and I know a lot of people stress about the corner, and they mark things and do all kinds of crazy stuff. But you really don't have to do that if you just follow a simple rule. What happens is you're going to want to kind of stop a 1/4 inch in, and I was trying to do that for forever. But then I realized I don't have to. So I'm going to stitch all the way to the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to show you a magic trick. So I came to the edge of the quilt. I didn't have to worry about where that 1/4 inch is because I'm going to use my scissors. Take this up. Now I want to pull this binding this way and over this way, but well, look what happens. When I pull it that way, those stitches just come through on the end. So as long as I don't reinforce my seam at the end, I could, but as long as I don't, they're going to literally just pop open the exact distance that I need them to pop open. It's great. So I'm going to pull it over this way. You want it to be a straight line along the quilt and the binding, and then I'm going to fold it back over itself. Now here's where you can get fussy. When you pull it over back on itself, you want this fold right along the edge of the quilt and these two folds here to be right on top of each other. Now a pin isn't going to go through all these layers, so I use my Wonder Clip there and here to hold it so that when I turn the quilt and get ready to sew again, everything stays put. Now I'm going to lower my presser foot. I'm going to start from the edge just like I did before, and here we go. I don't need that clip anymore, and I honestly don't need this one. Now, when I started to sew this binding on, I left myself a good long tail, well, you'll see when we get there, to help me join these two ends with that diagonal seam. and I want to leave a nice little gap between the two. I want not a lot of fabric to be able to do this. So I'm going to leave me quite a bit. That's probably about 16 inches. And let me show you what I do. So what I'm going to want to do, let me get these out of the way, is I want these two pieces to join with a diagonal seam. And that seems like it'd be hard to do, but it's really not. What I'm going to do is I'm going to overlap them the exact distance that they are wide. So this is a selvage. I'm just going to cut it off. And when I open that up, that is the exact width of that. Do you agree? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this nice and flat. I'm going to lay this over the top of that because that's the distance I want to overlap. Bring this piece down nice and flat, and I have an instant guide to know exactly how to overlap it. Check it out. Cool. Now they're overlapped the exact same distance that they are wide. Now this is why I leave a bunch, because what you're going to do is you're going to take your two binding pieces. We got to join it with that diagonal seam. We're going to take them here, turn them a quarter turn, and I'm going to sew diagonally from here to here, and it's going to lay nice and flat. My Wonder Clips are my friends. Now, if I hadn't left a whole bunch of fabric, I wouldn't be able to manipulate this. But if I didn't leave a big opening, but I did, so I can bring that up around, bring it up here. You kind of have to manhandle it just a little bit. And if you're not sure how this is going to work, put a pin in where the seam's going to go, and then you'll be able to tell that you've done it correctly. Now there's no line here. I could draw one, but let's just see if I can do it. I'm going from one corner to the other. Let's do it. Use my little scissors. Lift my foot, take my clips out. Now we're going to be able to see if I did it right. See if I did it. Oh my goodness. So it didn't twist. It lays nice and flat. I'm going to trim that seam, press it open, and then I'm just going to sew my binding on down. Now, let me show you exactly what I'm going to do to sew it down. We're going to pretend that's all joined. Now I'm going to come to a corner because that's one other trick I want to show you. So here's my corner, and because I'm bringing it from the back to the front, here it comes just like that. Here's the corner. It's going to pop up easily, and because this folded edge is a little bit farther in, when I sew it, part of my seam is going to be right along in here. Now I'm going to use the same thread on the back that I used when I quilted it, so it's just going to look like a quilting line. One of the other tricks, which is kind of important, can you see how one end tucks under and one end goes over the top? When I turn this corner, I'm going to put the end that's on the top on the bottom and the one that's on the bottom on the top. Take my clip and boom, there I go. I have a nice corner because it's going to like twist just a little bit. Now let's sew this down. I am going to bring it on up. Now, quite frankly, I'd probably take it to my ironing board and press it. I could even use a little piece of Wonder Tape in there to hold this binding down, to hold it precisely where I want it to be. But I'm going to turn it up and over just like this. Bring it on up. Now, when I sew through, because that binding's a little bit wider, I'm going to go through this top piece right here, right along the fold, and it's going to miss that bottom on the back, and it's going to look spectacular. Now I'm going to stitch a little bit and come to that corner, and I'm going to show you how the Presto is really going to help me. Bring it on up. Now the Presto has a needle down feature, which means when I stop sewing, that needle is going to automatically stay down, because I have a lot of manipulation to do when I'm doing my binding. So here we go. We're coming on up. I'm going to hold everything down. Stitch right across there, and boom, the needle stayed down because it's holding everything in place. All I have to do is lift my presser foot and turn and pull that on around, put my Wonder Clip on, and I'm ready to go around the whole quilt. Now you don't have to necessarily use a straight stitch when you're stitching this down. You can get creative, because if you have a machine that has some great decorative stitches, why not use them? So I've stitched out a few that might work quite nicely. These are the ones from the Presto, and I just wrote down the number of the stitch. I love this serpentine stitch, and that's a stitch you pretty much have to have an electronic machine to have. So I could sew that down with that serpentine stitch or any one of these other fun stitches. But now let's talk about doing that scallop binding. I'm going to come off here a little bit so I can come back and finish it a little bit later. Use my scissors, and let's do that scallop binding, because I know you want to learn how to do that. All right, so what I'm going to need for my scallop binding is my handout, because first and foremost I'm going to tell you the things I'm telling you now, they're all written down in your handout. So I started to sew that one as well. So I'm going to bring it on over and show you the fun thing. Now, look at this. What the heck is this? This is my statement necklace, because I'm of that age. What I do is I take my binding and I wind it around an old spool. And this is an old necklace that I found, and I just put it through there, and I am going to wear this literally around my neck. It's going to hold this binding exactly where I need it to be, and I don't have to worry about it when I'm going around all those scallops. So let me take out my pin, and I'm going to put on my statement necklace. I like it a little bit higher up on my neck, because you'll see why in a little bit. Okay, there's my necklace. Aren't I lovely? So in your handout, I talk about how you're going to mark the scallops. You're going to measure them, mark them, refer to the handout for that. But what I do is I mark where the edge of the scallop's going to be, and the edge of the binding is going to go right along there. I'm going to turn this corner just like I did on the other quilt, but when I come up to here, there's a little trick that I do. So I'm going to bring it on up, find that special seam. Remember, it's an electronic machine. It's easy to get back there. So here I go. We're going to come up to that corner. You saw me do it once before. It's going to be the same exact thing. Scissors. Now this outside corner, this is a half a scallop. So all I'm going to do is do that same corner that I did before. Bring it on up and around. And here's where the trick is. Now, if you're going to do scallops all the way around, this has one straight edge and the rest of them are scallops. I would start the scallop to do the join of the pieces right into here. And there's a special way I joined that's in the handout, so you want to refer to that. Here we go. Let's turn this corner, and then let's talk about how we're going to come around that scallop. Okay, now here's the part. I am going to have this raw edge of the fabric right along the line that I marked. Don't cut the scallops out before you sew the binding on. It's going to hold everything in exactly the right place where you want it to be. When you're coming around an edge like this, you have a tendency, most people do, to pull the fabric. Don't do it. Use your needle down feature on your machine, and you might want to take the machine and tell it you want to sew a little bit slowly. So when you're coming around here, you want to ease it in. So we're going to hold it just like this. When I'm coming around there, take your time. Because if you're putting a scallop on, it's probably one of those special quilts I talked about. Now here's the trick. I'm going to come up to this point of the scallop, the V of the scallop. When I come up there, I am going to take my little wooden stick or stylus, and I'm going to know that I want to stop sewing straight up from the bottom of the scallop. In this case, I have a print, and I know exactly where I need to stop. So here we go. We're going to come up to there, and we're going to stop, and once again, needle down is my absolute friend. Without needle down, this would be a lot harder. So I'm going to lift my presser foot, I'm going to turn my quilt so this is now coming straight at me, and see how my necklace is holding everything up and out of the way? You want to pull this around, use your little tool to bring it around, get it pretty darn close, hold it, pull this part out of the way, and then lower your presser foot. Now when I come out of it, I'm going to want to give it a little tiny pull. Boom. Not a lot. And am I coming around here? I'm going to ease it around. All I have to do if I need more fabric is just lean back and it's going to roll out from my statement necklace. That's all you do for a scallop. You come to the point, you use your needle down feature, and when you come out of it, make sure there's no fabric underneath there. It's not that challenging. It's just a little time consuming, and use it on those very special quilts. So I think that I'm going to finish using my bias binding with my statement necklace on my Baby Lock Presto 2. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember, there's a handout with lots of key information. So the Presto 2 electronic machine, oh my gosh, it's kind of what you need to get some quality work done. I'm going to send it over to George while I finish doing my bias binding, and I think he's got a heck of a deal for you on the Presto 2.
Thanks, Kathy. That was an incredible presentation. Don't forget to click on the link to download the outline for today's presentation. Now, the Baby Lock Presto 2 is one of our most popular machines. It offers high quality features at a very affordable price. The 7-point feed system really handles the fabric from denim to sheer, even elastic. Plus, it's so easy to access all 100 of these stitches. These stitches are quilting stitches, satin stitches, decorative, utility stitches. It even has 7 one-step buttonholes as well as built-in alphabets. So you see, this has plenty of features. Now, the Baby Lock Presto 2 has a regular retail price of $1,299, but right now it's on sale for $699, as well as we are offering free shipping across the country. But wait. There's more. For the first few that orders, you'll get this bonus that includes a set of rose gold scissors, all kinds of Class A needles, and some different thread, both utility and decorative thread. This has a value well over $150, and it's included free while supplies last. So don't wait. Click on the link to order. You can call us at 1-800-865-9664. or email me at moreso@aol.com. Bye for now.